The house on Hawthorne Avenue was silent, its curtains drawn against the gray February light. Inside, a young woman's voice rose in anger, then fear. The argument that began as something ordinary, something familiar, spiraled in seconds into something no one could have imagined. Somewhere between the sound of breaking breaths and trembling silence, everything changed. By the time the sun set that evening, the warmth and laughter that once filled that home were gone, replaced by a secret so dark it would take detectives weeks to uncover what really happened behind that locked door. This is the story of Joanne Nelson, the woman who vanished on Valentine's Day, and the devastating truth that would shatter everyone who loved her. Joanne was the kind of person everyone gravitated toward, cheerful, kind, and always thinking about others before herself. She had grown up in a close-knit family with her parents, Jean and Charlie, and her two younger sisters, Katie and Janie. Her childhood was warm and full of energy. She was the golden child, the one who seemed destined for great things. As a student at the University of York, Joanne excelled academically and socially. She had a natural ability to connect with people and a strong sense of compassion that once led her to study nursing. But she quickly realized that her heart was too soft for that line of work. The suffering of her patients affected her deeply. After leaving nursing, she joined a job center in Hull, helping others find work and stability. Those who knew her said she genuinely cared about improving people's lives, always with that bright smile and an encouraging word. Her warmth and openness drew people to her, including Paul Dyson, a nightclub bouncer 7 years her senior. When they met, the attraction was immediate, and soon they were inseparable. Despite her parents' concerns about them moving too fast, the couple rented a small terrace house in Hull, where they started building a life together. At first, everything seemed promising. Joanne dreamed about having a family one day, and Paul appeared to share her hopes. But as time passed, cracks began to appear. Joanne was ambitious. She wanted to travel, to grow, to keep discovering new sides of life. Paul, on the other hand, was content to stay home and live a simple, quiet existence. Their differences soon became impossible to ignore. Friends described Joanne as organized, tidy, and full of purpose, while Paul often appeared lazy and indifferent. His lack of motivation frustrated her. Still, despite their growing tensions, they decided to get engaged, perhaps in the hope that love could fix what was already falling apart. But instead of bringing them closer, the engagement only deepened their divide. Then came Valentine's Day, 2005. Joanne didn't show up for work that morning, something completely out of character. She was responsible, punctual, and dedicated to her job. Her colleagues grew concerned when she failed to call in or answer her phone. By that evening, the people who loved her most were worried sick. That night, Paul Dyson contacted the police to report his fiancé missing. According to him, he had left her in bed early that morning before going to work. And when he returned home later in the day, she was gone. Her car was still parked outside. The doors were locked, and her belongings were untouched. At first, his story seemed believable, but something about it didn't sit right with Joanne's family. Her father, Charlie, told police that he didn't trust Paul. Joanne would never vanish without a word. Not from work, not from her family, and certainly not on Valentine's Day. As the hours turned into days, a massive search operation began. Police officers, soldiers, and volunteers combed through the countryside looking for any trace of Joanne. Flyers with her smiling face were posted across Hull. Candlelight vigils were held. Everyone wanted to believe she was still out there somewhere. Meanwhile, Paul inserted himself deeply into the search efforts. He walked door-to-door with volunteers, attended public appeals, and even gave interviews to the press, sometimes without the family's consent. To the public, he looked like a grieving fiancé, desperate for answers. His emotional appeals drew sympathy from strangers who saw him as another victim in a heartbreaking mystery. But to detectives, something about his behavior didn't feel right. He seemed too rehearsed, too eager to appear innocent. And behind that facade of heartbreak, subtle cracks began to form. His timeline was vague, his emotions sometimes forced, and his willingness to engage with the media even before the police had all the facts raised quiet alarm bells. The televised interview that Paul Dyson gave just 2 days after Joanne Nelson's disappearance would become one of the most disturbing and revealing moments of the entire case. He had not informed police before agreeing to appear on camera. In fact, investigators only learned of the interview when they saw it broadcast on television. The man they believed to be a worried fiancé, crying publicly for his missing partner. But not everyone was convinced by what they saw. Body language expert Cliff Lansley later analyzed the footage and concluded that Paul's emotional display was nothing more than an act. According to Lansley, Paul wasn't closing his eyes in sadness. He was deliberately squeezing them to force out tears. It was a performance, a way to manipulate those watching and project an image of heartbreak. While the interview may have fooled the public, detectives watching closely noticed something far more significant than the crocodile tears. They spotted what would later become one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the case. On the screen, clearly visible on the back of Paul's thumbs, were 2 distinct crescent-shaped marks, fingernail scratches. For them, the sight was chillingly familiar. In previous cases involving strangulation, victims often left marks like these as they desperately clawed at their attackers' hands, trying to free themselves. Joanne, it seemed, had done the same. Her final act was one of resistance, leaving behind silent testimony on the skin of the man who took her life. From that moment, Paul Dyson was no longer just the concerned boyfriend on TV. He was the prime suspect. Police began watching him closely. His exaggerated sorrow, his eagerness to stay in the public eye, and now the physical marks. Everything pointed to guilt. But it wasn't the detectives who ultimately brought him down. It was his own mother. After the televised appeal, Paul confided in his martial arts instructor, telling him the unthinkable, that he had killed Joanne. He was horrified and unsure what to do. Torn between loyalty and morality, he eventually went to Paul's mother and told her everything. Confronted with the horrific truth, Paul's mother made a decision that no parent should ever have to make. She went straight to the police. With that, the facade finally collapsed. When detectives confronted him with what they knew, Paul admitted he had been lying. 6 days after he first reported Joanne missing, he was arrested. He claimed that on Valentine's Day, 2005, he and Joanne were at their home when they began to argue. According to Paul, Joanne had been criticizing his lack of effort around the house, a recurring issue between them. That morning, she asked him to use the washing machine. He told police that her request made him feel humiliated and incapable, as though she was reminding him of everything he wasn't. As the argument escalated, Joanne told him she was leaving, that she would sell the house and move on with her life. That, Paul claimed, sent him into a rage. He wrapped his hands around her neck and strangled her until she stopped breathing. After killing her, Paul didn't panic. He didn't run. Instead, he became methodical, cold. He cleaned himself up, thought through his next steps, and began creating a cover story. He walked calmly to his mother's house and borrowed a garden fork, making small talk with neighbors about buying a cat with Joanne, the very woman he had just murdered. When asked how she was, he said casually, "She's fine." Next, he stopped by a local shop to buy trash bags, rubber gloves, and disinfectant spray. Surveillance footage captured him walking in, composed and emotionless, as if running errands. Back at the house, he tied Joanne's hands and feet, sealed her body inside multiple garbage bags, and taped them shut. He then carried her out of the house and placed her in her car in broad daylight. The audacity of it stunned investigators later. Neighbors saw nothing suspicious. He even drove to a gas station to refuel. Joanne's body still in the car. From there, he drove about 75 miles to a remote woodland area near Bransdale, North Yorkshire. There, he carried Joanne's body roughly 250 yards into the trees until he found a small dip in the ground. Surrounded by pine needles and silence, he left her there, the woman he once claimed to love. He covered her with branches and leaves, hiding her from view. Then he got back into her car and drove home. Before reporting her missing, Paul even pretended to call Joanne on the phone with an earshot of others, staging the fake conversation to make it seem as though she was still alive. The next day, he went to work as if nothing had happened. He smiled. He spoke to colleagues, and he continued to play the role of a devoted partner while Joanne lay buried in the woods. To everyone around him, he was the grieving fiancé, desperately waiting for her return. But behind the mask, Paul Dyson had already written the final chapter of Joanne Nelson's life, one defined by cruelty, deceit, and cold-blooded calculation. And it was all captured in plain sight on camera, in a televised performance meant to win sympathy, but that instead exposed the truth. And even after confessing, Paul's manipulation continued. He told police that he couldn't remember where he had buried Joanne's body, forcing investigators and her devastated family to endure weeks of uncertainty. Paul offered only fragments, vague descriptions that seemed to mock the people searching for her. He claimed he had left her body by a metal gate near some green bottles, and mentioned seeing trees he thought were western hemlock, birch, or hornbeam, all common in North Yorkshire. It wasn't much to go on, but for the investigators who refused to give up, it was enough. Using Paul's incomplete recollections, police began combing through rural areas that matched the clues. They searched field after field, path after path, with every gate and patch of woodland becoming a possible site. For 6 relentless weeks, hundreds of officers and volunteers joined the operation, crossing 3 counties in search of Joanne. The sheer scale of the search was immense, a testament to the determination of those who wanted to bring her home. Then on March 24th, 2005, exactly 39 days after Joanne vanished, the search came to an end. The police noticed a gate that matched Paul's description, a metal gate with green bottles scattered nearby. They followed a narrow trail leading away from the gate, weaving through the trees for a quarter of a mile until they reached a shallow dip in the ground. The forest was quiet, but what they saw next confirmed their worst fears. Hidden beneath branches and pine needles was a garbage bag. Inside it, the outline of a human leg was visible through the plastic. It was Joanne Nelson. Her body had been carefully wrapped in several bags, tied together, and buried beneath makeshift camouflage. The scene was haunting, the final resting place of a young woman whose life had been taken in an act of senseless rage. The discovery ended the long search, but for her family, it also made the nightmare real. Their hope was gone. When Joanne's remains were officially identified, her parents, John and Charlie, were informed their daughter, the girl who had lit up every room she entered, was never coming home. In the aftermath, police began to piece together the darker picture of Paul Dyson's life, one that Joanne had never fully known. Behind his outward charm, Paul had a reputation that few outside his circle understood. Among locals, he was known as a big man with a big mouth, someone who enjoyed dominating others and bragging about his strength. His nickname, Psycho, which he claimed came from his years as a nightclub bouncer, wasn't a joke. It reflected his violent temper and reputation for aggression. He liked to believe he was irresistible to women, confident, charming, even sophisticated. But those who actually knew him described something very different. An insecure man with a volatile temper who used intimidation and manipulation to mask his own failures. Paul's life story hinted at a pattern of inherited violence. His father, Peter Dyson, had a violent past. In 1967, Peter stabbed and killed his wife's lover, John Dickinson, a 22-year-old man from Barnsley. He served 6 years for manslaughter before returning home. Then in 1974, just 2 days after Paul was born, Peter was involved in a fatal hit and run. The victim, Gordon Kell, a 47-year-old father of 7, had been walking home after celebrating his silver wedding anniversary, 25 years of marriage, when Peter struck him with his car and left him to die on the road. He never stopped. For Paul, violence was not just learned, it was inherited. After finishing school, he followed his father to Saudi Arabia, working with him in maintenance. Those who knew him said that he worshipped his father, Peter Dyson, and that he never fully recovered from his death in the year 2000. Peter had died of a heart attack in Saudi Arabia at the age of 55, but not before leaving a dangerous imprint on his son, one that glorified dominance and violence. For Paul, his father's life story wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a model to follow. Before Joanne entered his life, Paul had already built a troubling history with women. His relationships were turbulent, intense, and often violent. One of his earliest significant relationships began in 1993 when he met Carrie Thompson at Bishop Burton Agricultural College. What started as a normal young romance soon turned into something darker. Carrie later told investigators that Paul's temper was explosive. During arguments, he would pace back and forth, punch walls, and physically restrain her from leaving. His need for control was absolute, and his anger could flip without warning. In June 1999, Paul began another relationship, this time with Jenny Marie Clark, who would soon become his wife, and later his ex-wife. The pair got engaged just 2 weeks after meeting, a sign of Paul's impulsiveness and intensity, but their relationship quickly spiraled into violence. On their wedding night, Paul assaulted her for the first time. It was the beginning of a horrific pattern. Jenny later described how the abuse escalated, recounting multiple attacks, including one night when he choked her until she lost consciousness. The way he squeezed the life out of her echoed the same method he would later use on Joanne. Despite the escalating violence, Jenny and Paul had a daughter together named Chloe, born in October 2000. Their relationship came to an end in 2002, shortly before Paul met Joanne. When Jenny eventually encountered Joanne, she immediately sensed that the young woman seemed gentle and reserved, someone unlikely to confront or challenge him. Her instincts proved accurate. Joanne, compassionate and trusting by nature, had no idea of the man she was living with, or the violent past he concealed. According to her sister Katie, Joanne had been unaware of Paul's history and would never have accepted such behavior in someone she intended to marry and start a family with. When Joanne disappeared on Valentine's Day in 2005, Katie initially believed Paul's display of grief. He came to her home in tears, claiming to have no idea where Joanne was, and she comforted him, believing his distress was genuine. Later that day, he said he needed to go for a walk to calm down. Concerned that neighbors might suspect him, Katie went out to look for him and found him sitting alone at a bus stop crying. She tried to reassure him, unaware of the significance of what she saw. Faint scratches across his hands, marks that she would later realize had been left by Joanne in her final moments. In the aftermath, the realization was unbearable. The very gestures of comfort Katie had offered him were toward the man responsible for her sister's death. The trial began on November 7th, 2005. The courtroom was packed with journalists, officers, and Joanne's family. Everyone expected a long and painful legal battle, but instead, Paul Dyson pleaded guilty on the very first day. A soft murmur of yes rippled through the court as Joanne's relatives finally heard him admit what they had always known. Paul stood emotionless, staring straight ahead. He refused to look at Joanne's family or the police officers who had searched tirelessly for her. He showed no remorse, no tears, no apology. Even when his own defense lawyer told the court that there were no excuses for what he had done, Paul remained cold and silent. The next day, November 8th, nearly 10 months after Joanne's murder, Paul was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years. The sentence brought a small sense of relief, a recognition that justice had finally been served. But that peace would not last. In 2019, after serving just 14 years, the now 45-year-old Paul Dyson was transferred to an open prison where inmates are gradually reintegrated into society. The parole board even recommended him for day release, meaning he could leave the facility unsupervised for hours at a time. In their report, the parole board claimed that Paul had taken part in programs designed to help offenders recognize and deal with their problems, including therapy aimed at addressing his relationship issues. Officials insisted he had changed. But for Joanne's family, the news was devastating. Her sister Katie spoke publicly about the decision, saying that hearing Paul was walking free was like reopening an old wound. The situation worsened in 2022, when just 3 years after being moved to open conditions, Paul Dyson was recommended for full release, having served just over 17 years, barely a year beyond the minimum term. He was allowed to walk free under probation supervision. A spokesperson for the parole board defended the decision, saying that every release involves a vigorous process and that the panel's only concern was whether the prisoner's risk to the public could be safely managed. They said they had reviewed reports from psychologists, probation officers, and prison staff, ultimately concluding that Dyson's risk level was manageable. For Joanne's family, no justification could erase their pain. Katie said that her family now lives in fear of seeing him again. The media has not confirmed where Paul Dyson is living or what restrictions, if any, have been placed on him. He remains on probation, meaning that any violation could send him back to prison. But for Joanne's family, that's little comfort. Joanne's story remains one of heartbreak and injustice, a reminder of how one man's violence destroyed a family and how even decades later, the echoes of that crime still haunt those left behind. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you can be the first to hear about such real-life stories.